Good evening, everyone. My name is Charlotte Charlier, and I'm visiting from Victoria, British Columbia. As a guest here in Winnipeg, I wish to acknowledge that we are gathered on Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Niniwak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Oyate, Dene, and Inuit, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here and to learn on these lands. We recognize that the treaties signed on these lands are a lifelong, enduring relationship, and we are dedicated to upholding their spirit and intent. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and the present. With this understanding, we commit to supporting Indigenous excellence through active reconciliation, meaningful change, and the creation of an environment where everyone can thrive. I would also like to thank the staff and leadership of the Agowiidiwinan Centre for welcoming us into this beautiful space and for their ongoing work fostering understanding of the treaties and the relationships they represent. It's now my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, Drawing Justice, Graphic Novels and Human Rights, a panel event presented as part of the Survivor-Centered Visual Narratives Annual General Meeting. Together with Dr. Andrea Webb, I'm the project co-director of Survivor-Centered Visual Narratives, an international research project that explores visual storytelling and graphic narratives as a care-based strategy and methodology to render visible the voices of survivors of genocide and mass atrocities. In close dialogue and exchange across 5 research clusters, the Holocaust, Iraq, Syria, Rwanda, Turtle Island, Yugoslav wars, our project co-develops arts-based testimony gathering practices that are interconnected, yet respect the singular cultural and historical context of each research site. The project's foremost commitment is to the participating survivors who hold unique knowledge not only of the mass atrocities themselves, but also of the process of sharing their stories. I will now introduce tonight's moderator, Dr. Shell Anderson. Shell, to my left, is an associate professor of law at the University of Manitoba, specializing in genocide perpetrator studies, international criminal law, and transitional justice. Shell is the author of Perpetrating Genocide, a criminological account, and co-editor of Researching Perpetrators of Genocide. His fieldwork spans Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, Bosnia, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and northern Iraq, where he has investigated atrocity crimes, victim experiences, and perpetrator narratives. Shell has held academic positions at the University of Amsterdam, Leiden University, the University of the Fraser Valley, and the National University of Rwanda, and worked with NGOs, think tanks, and international organizations. Shell's current project include books on Dominic Ongwen and the Lord's Resistance Army and the Rohingya Genocide, a graphic novel on the Yazidi Genocide, and a scholarly book on epistemic injustice and transitional justice. He's a member of Survivor-Centered Visual Narratives of the Governing Board and the Syria-Iraq Cluster co-lead. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure and delight to introduce tonight's event. Over to you, Shell.
So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the event. And thank you so much, Charlotte, for the kind introduction and for the land acknowledgement as well. And I think it's wonderful to gather with you here, particularly in this space of learning, relationship, and responsibility, which I think is an appropriate space for the things that we're going to be talking about tonight, a conversation about storytelling, about justice, and about community. Tonight's event grows out of the Survivor-Centered Visual Narratives project, as Charlotte said. And I'm not going to talk about myself much, but a lot of my work involves interviewing and basically speaking with and collecting stories from survivors of mass atrocities and also perpetrators of mass atrocities and I guess bystanders as well, and listening to stories of loss, resilience, explanations of violence. And these conversations have really shaped the way that I think about justice And more I see justice not only in legal processes, but in the act of storytelling itself, and people being able to tell their own story the way they want to tell it, which I think is really fundamental. And I think survivor-centered visual narratives emerge from a similar understanding. So the project has been shaped by artists, by survivors, and by community partners who have pushed us in a good way to think carefully about how stories are created, who gets to tell them, and how we can work in ways that honor lived experiences rather than just extracting. And we all know academic work and journalism, I suppose, can also be extractive at times, but we're really trying to work in a better way. Graphic novels might seem like an unexpected medium to tell stories about human rights, but I think that they offer something rare. They hold complexity and emotion in a way that's accessible without still being reductive. They invite readers into lived experience rather than speaking about people from a kind of distance, which is sometimes a comfortable distance. They create also space for collaboration between artists and communities, survivors and storytellers, knowledge keepers, and audiences. So tonight we're joined by 4 people who embody this spirit of collaborative and ethical storytelling. Duncan McCue, and I'll also introduce people in more detail in a moment, but Duncan McCue, who's a journalist, author, and a leading voice, I think, on Indigenous storytelling as well as on media ethics. Sonya Ballantyne, who's a writer and filmmaker whose work centers Indigenous youth, girlhood, and the imaginative power of the visual narrative. Mike Agowiidiwinan, who's a scholar, an athlete, a member of the SCVN team, as well as Duncan, whose work bridges community, experience, identity, and representation. And Candida Rifkind, who's a professor at the University of Winnipeg, and she's a scholar of comics and of graphic narratives whose research has helped to shape how we understand the politics and responsibilities of the medium. So it's not just a conversation tonight, I hope, about art, but we're also thinking about voice, we're thinking about agency, we're thinking about justice, how we can create forms of storytelling that honor the people at the center of this story. So thank you everybody for being here, for supporting us in this work and joining us in our conversation tonight, thinking about what justice can look like when it's drawn, spoken, and shared together. So please join us in welcoming our 4 panelists. And our main format tonight will be a kind of panel discussion, and we'll have a panel amongst us, and then we'll have a little break, and then we'll have questions. But I'm also going to introduce now people in a bit more detail, because I think it kind of leads us into the discussion and tells us something about the people that we're working with here. So Sonya Ballantyne, she, they, is a Swampy Cree writer, filmmaker, and speaker based in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Her work explores contemporary and futuristic portrayals of Indigenous women and girls. Her award-winning projects include the documentary Nosasim, is that correct? Yeah. Thank you. Which was award-winning, in the graphic novel Little by Little. Her film The Death Tour screened at Cannes in 2023 with a world premiere at the Slam Dance Film Festival. She's also worked as a sensitivity consultant for gaming properties such as God of War Ragnarok. People are interested in that one. I see that always catches people's attention for sure. Candida Rifkind, Dr. Candida Rifkind is a professor of English at the University of Winnipeg, where she specializes in nonfiction comics and Canadian literature. In addition to over 25 articles and book chapters, she's the co-author of Graphic Refuge, Visuality, and Mobility in Refugee Comics, as you can see there. There's one copy. I don't know if it's for sale. One copy here, I mean.
I forgot to bring copies for sale, but McNally upstairs has them, I believe.
Yeah.
I can get you a discount.
And it's the first in-depth study of comics about refugees, something else I'm very interested in working in Rohingya camps at the moment, about refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, and detainees by artists in the global north and south. She's also co-edited 2 scholarly edited essay collections documenting trauma, traumatic past, embodied histories, and graphic reportage in comics, and Canadian graphic picture and life narratives. Dr. Rifkind helps to maintain the Indigenous Comics Annotated Bibliography, an online open access resource hosted by the journal Jeunesse. Her next project is on food, comics, and cultural memory. This is why I want to read the bios, because I have to say we really do have 4 impressive bios here. Duncan McCue is an award-winning broadcaster and educator. He's an associate professor at Carleton University in the School of Journalism. He's also the director of the Certificate in Journalism in Indigenous Communities, which I wasn't aware of, which sounds really interesting. He's a longtime CBC radio host. That's how I first discovered your work, actually, the podcast Cooper Island, which I loved. And TV news correspondent. He's the author of Decolonizing Journalism, A Guide to Reporting in Indigenous Communities, as well as The Shoe Boy, which is a memoir of his time spent on a trapline with Cree communities, a Cree family in northern Quebec. He's a proud Anishinaabe from the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation in southern Ontario. And finally, we have Mike Outsey, Michael Makwa, which means bear, I guess, right? Mm-hmm. Michael Makwa Bear Ioutsey is a former hockey player of Anishinaabe, Lac Seul First Nation, Estonian descent, and grew up in Toronto's Annex. He's the coordinator of Indigenous Initiatives at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Kinesiology. In addition, he's a doctoral candidate at McGill, exploring the role of ice hockey in his home community of Lac Seul First Nation. And he was a professional hockey player as well. His hockey career saw him represent the Lac Seul Tomahawks, as well as the University of Toronto Varsity Blues, and Team Estonia in the IHF, in the International Ice Hockey Federation, which is, for me, a particularly interesting twist. But we'll be talking about all that. And Duncan and Mike are collaborating as well on a graphic novel, which is about you, actually, and about your father as well, your father George, and about residential schools. So we'll be talking about all these things tonight. So maybe I'll start with a very general question, and anybody can jump in who wants to jump in. But what is distinctive about graphic novels as a way of telling stories about human rights broadly considered? Maybe you don't think of yourself as telling human rights stories, but stories about human rights, about social justice. What is unique, do you think, about that medium?
I think for me, at least as a graphic novelist, I fell into it. I ended up writing my book little by little with Michael Champagne, who probably some of you know. And I had been working on some form of my graphic novel, Unbeatable Sonya Ballantyne, in some form, like documentary. And finally, it seemed to work most as a graphic novel because some of the stuff that I put in that book would be impossible to film. I also feel like the format would have been very weird because I jumped back and forth in time during that book. But I also had a lot of freedom in order to just jump from whatever type of images I wanted to show. Like I could rip off all the imagery I wanted, and it felt like I had that freedom in a way I might not when I was in film. And plus I love one of the things I loved about the graphic novel is I believe the truth shouldn't get in the way of a good story. And so I do elaborate on certain things, or I do kind of fudge certain things in this book because I wanted it to be an Indigenous superhero origin story. And so I wrote it with that in mind. And so like some certain things, like I have good parents in the book. In real life, that might not have been the case. And I do that truthfully, but I also realized too how important it was to focus on that. Like I also wanted to do a very accessible Indigenous story for young kids. That was my big focus. Was why I went into this format as well. Was I could get really radical and I could indoctrinate the kids before the parents realized I was. So, yeah, because there's certain things I could say in a graphic novel that I couldn't say in film or documentaries. Like a 9-year-old is not going to go see my documentary, The Death Tour, but they will read this. And I feel like that's something that was really helpful because I get to them when they're young.
Okay, so to switch gears a bit, I have been working on comics by and about refugees, and I don't use that in the legal sense. I need it to include all people who are forcibly displaced, because refugee is a legal term. So my slide of the umbrella of refugee comics actually helps to answer this question, because it includes a lot of different genres or ways of telling the stories. So I just wanted to show what comics can do to tell stories, whether it's refugee artists themselves or more often in collaboration with a non-refugee artist, often commissioned by an NGO, an activist group, or an academic group. So we have graphic journalism, and Joe Sacco is kind of the father of that. And people may know his work with the Dene people, that is his book, Paying the Land. Also Sarah Glidden's Rolling Blackouts, which is an interesting one that I could talk about a bit later. We have autobiographies, and generally they tend to be of second generation displaced people who have grown up to be artists and are trying to understand their lives as the child of refugees. And Thi Louise, The Best We Could Do, she's Vietnamese American, is a beautiful, wonderful book. So this is also my recommendation list. To the world, that we are increasingly seeing comics coming out of Gaza by Palestinian cartoonists, and the Gazan comics community is growing with the support of Palestinian American presses. But we also get beyond those kind of graphic journalism and autobiography tend to be the nonfiction genres where stories like this are being told. There's also really interesting experiments and hybrids. So Ting's Chak is a Chinese-Canadian architect and cartoonist, and she's based in Toronto, and she has this book called Undocumented, which is it combines comics and architectural drawings of the secretive sites where asylum seekers and detainees are being held in the suburbs of Toronto that people drive past all the time, but we're not allowed to go inside. So one thing comics can do in this circumstance is go where cameras can't. There are, of course, cameras everywhere in detention sites, but they're surveillance cameras. But in terms of going into places, even refugee camps, or talking to people who are undocumented but hiding their identity through the comics caricature or making up a name, that straight up filmed journalism might not be able to do. And then I just wanted to emphasize that comics are fun, comics are great stories. And so we do see some very serious stories about violence, conflict, forcible displacement showing up in science fiction. So there's Sean Tan's The Arrival, which is one of my favorites. It's a silent, wordless steampunk fantasy novel about a nameless migrant arriving in a fantastical city. Temple of Refuge is a crowdsourced project by a Kurdish refugee living in the former Tempelhof airport in Berlin, who wanted to imagine a city where refugees are not just welcome, but where the space is built by and for refugees. And since part of his displacement was the result of drought, this city is full of green spaces. Also, refugees have agency here. What they draw on their phones comes to life. Phones are a big part of it. Online comics, in terms of accessibility, it's not just for audience. Today, young artists often start by self-publishing online. And then there's also interactive comics, which are super interesting, where the reader is not quite at the level of gaming, but the reader has some user control and can trigger sound effects or go back and forth or go in through Zoom technology into a scene and go around, say, a refugee camp that they might never personally visit. So there's really interesting things happening in terms of the range of storytelling. And I think comics are just, they're a vessel that you can throw any story into, and then you can combine it with things like interactive documentaries or steampunk fantasy, and the stories will emerge.
Duncan, I don't know if I think this is probably the first graphic novel you
It is my first graphic novel, yeah. So I'm going to combine two things that both Sonya and Candida said. You talked about youth and comic books. That was my exposure to comics, was reading Spider-Man and Richie Rich and Archie comics as a kid, just avidly. And I think we all understand that kids are just drawn to comics because it is such a visual language, and so we're exposed to comics very young. Many kids are. Fast forward a bunch of years, I ended up at CDC for 25 years as a visual storyteller first, working 20 years in television. What often frustrated me was exactly what you said, which is that you're slave to what you can get in video or what you can get in photos. You have to lead with your pictures. You have to tell a story through photos, and that's all you can tell. If you have things that aren't documented visually, then you have to come up with creative ways to try to, this is why you see these recreations or all kinds of different things that television journalists do to try to tell parts of the story that aren't captured. That always frustrated me, particularly when we're talking about residential schools and the residential school history of this country. because so much of it was documented through the colonizers' gaze. The images that we do have were taken by the church, or they were taken by the federal government to either promote or document, record the good work that the country was doing, that the churches were doing. And so those images that we have, those black and white images that come up every National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, are all through the colonizers' gaze. And that was frustrating for me, working for 20 plus years in media, trying to tell that story. So when Charlotte approached me and said, would you be interested in working on a graphic novel about genocide? I was like, I know the story I want to tell. And so thank you, Ellie, for bringing up the slides. I'll run you through really quickly, just because it is my first graphic novel, and I'm kind of excited about it. And I think it'll help Mike in terms of explaining his role, and very crucial role in this. The story that I wanted to tell was about the role of sports and hockey in residential schools. I've heard a lot of survivor stories about the awful things that happened at the schools, and we all know that over 150,000 children were taken from their families and forced to go to schools where they were indoctrinated and treated in terrible ways. But the less known story about residential schools are the sports and some of the cultural activities that the children had opportunities to do. And that's a double-edged sword. Those sports have both good things and bad things about them. And I thought that comics would be an excellent way to tell that story. As it turns out, this fella here, who I originally approached to be a research assistant, ended up being the subject of the story. His father, George Kenny, went to Pelican Lake Indian Residential School in Northern Ontario. There's George there. And Mike shared his dad's story with me, and lo and behold, after 3 years of research, working with Mike and George, hearing their story about George going to residential school, Mike taking me up to investigate his doctoral research on the role of hockey in the community of Lac Seul First Nation, and even getting on the blades together. We have a story called Indians Do Cry, which is Mike and George's story. For those of you who don't know, the Pelican Lake School was built in about 1930, early 1920s. Again, there's a long history of terrible things that happened to children there. Over 20 children died. 15 children were reported missing and never found. George attended the school in the 1950s and 60s, and unhappy things happened to him there as well. He was taken away from his family, multiple times ran away from the school. But one of the saving graces for George was that he got to play hockey. There's the Pelican Lake Indian Residential School. And so George talks about that in our graphic novel. In George's words, and I think this is fair to say, Mike, I don't want to talk too much about Mike and George because I'll let Mike talk, but George's words are that he abandoned Mike as a young boy. Is that fair to say? Yes. And so didn't get to have as close a relationship as Mike may have liked. But Mike went on to his own incredible semi-pro hockey career. And that's where the story intersects, is hockey and how the schools in many ways had a direct impact on George and George's family, his son Mike, but hockey is what brought them together. So that's what our book Indians Do Cry is about, and it'll be published next in the fall of 2027, and I'm going to pass it over to Mike.
So I think the flow of the talk is probably going away from the original question right now. You called it. Michelle said that's what was going to happen. And yeah, say a million things right now, but you know, there was moments in the years like before I lost my dad in November, where I was like, he did learn to cry in the last like 11 years, 10 years. So that's why the title is apt, because his original publication of Indians Don't Cry in 77, that was like, we're like, used to pain, but we'll just suck it up and not cry. And we've had to sort of learn to cry and open up. And so it was really beautiful in those moments where he'd cry uncontrollably, because I understand that was him healing and releasing things that he'd pent up for a number of decades. And I remember just sitting there in the TV room in Thunder Bay, and he's just like, I abandoned you before your 4th birthday, boy. I'm like, yeah, Dad, but like, you were abandoned, you were taken away from your family, so here we are. and things worked out, and we're good. And reuniting when I was still 20 years old, and getting over drinking and smoking, cannabis and cigarettes. And I got fired from Via Rail, and like, for going to the Montreal-Toronto hockey game. And like, I was in trouble, and he called when I was clearing out my office, and he says, "Hey, heard you got fired from Via Rail. Are you okay?" I said, "Yeah, I'm okay, Dad." He goes, "Hey, why don't you come up north? We're gonna get you your status card. Become a legal Indian to play in the Northern Bands hockey tournament. You need your treaty card for your community to play." Then the tournament was in Sioux Lookout, 32 teams. And he's like, "One day it might help you get into school and access treaty funding. That's your right, but that's the only way you can play." And I just came up, we reconnected, had some awesome years. And we won it the year in March before we lost them, which was wonderful. And, you could sit there and watch hockey for like 12 hours a day, 7 days for the whole tournament. Anyways, yeah, but happy to wrangle the conversation back. But, just like him, gift of the gab, I guess. And he was just so happy to be so giving of himself, as I feel that I am, because if he can help people that went through what he went through, and I can help people like me who grew up in the cities and come into our indigeneity in good time, then that makes us happy. And Canada, hockey, it's a story, but it's more to hockey than life, as my auntie said. You were right.
So maybe since we were talking about the graphic novel you're working on, maybe I'll ask you, Sonya, about the unbeatable Sonya Ballantyne, or whatever you want to talk about. But I'm especially curious about this one.
Yes. So my graphic novel, The Unbeatable Sonya Ballantyne, is a superhero origin story of me. It follows, basically, it starts with me writing the story, like as an adult in my modern bedroom. And then it looks at like my relationship with my grandmother, my relationship with my parents, dealing with racism and sexism as a young girl. The very first racist encounter I had in that story was when I was 3 years old. And it was a white man who found out, because one of my father's favorite things to do was brag when his kids were doing well. And I had learned how to read when I went to nursery school, because my goal was, I actually talk about it in the book, but he's not named. My teacher had a Stephen King book on her desk. And I saw how big it was, and I was like, wow, that is amazing. And she saw me looking at it with like the big anime eyes. And she's like, he gets paid to write those books. And I was like, wow. Up until that point, I thought jobs were gonna suck, because my parents were like, oh yeah, when you get older, you're gonna have a job that you hate. And I was like, that's a kind of job I want. Like, that's my kind of scam, because I've always been a storyteller. And so the graphic novel really focuses on the media and the stuff I love that helped me deal with specifically the racism, but also the sexism and being two-spirited and like that sort of thing. And it's very heavily influenced by Superman, who I also did a TED Talk about. It's also influenced by Star Trek. It's influenced by The Lord of the Rings was a big one. I compare my mother in the book, our relationship to each other as Galadriel. Like there's even a scene where she is depicted as Galadriel. And like, it was a fun way to do it because I always knew that like, sadly, the story of many Indigenous children is trauma. Even if they did get like a really good life, there is still a lot of trauma for a lot of kids. And I basically wanted to tell a happy story not a happy story, but I also wanted to tell like a superhero story about somebody who persevered. And I'm like, I didn't intend for it to be me, but I was like, well, if somebody has to do it, it might as well be me. But I also really love the idea of including this part in the story where my grandmother once asked my mother, why is Sonya so weird? And that really hurt my feelings because I was like, Grandma, like, what? And my grandma was incredibly blunt as a child when I was young because she never learned English until she was in her 30s. And so I was reading a Superman comic book in the car before I knew I was car sick. I get to a page of kryptonite and I throw up all over it and I'm like, oh my God, I'm Superman. And I was like 5 years old. And so I put that into the story. But it was something that I guess a lot of people have stories that make them survive. Superman was what made me survive because even though I knew as a child that Superman wasn't real, I remember going, nobody makes a character like that if they don't know somebody like that. So he exists somewhere. And so I'm like, until I meet that guy, I'm gonna keep going. But yeah, when I'm to do a last Superman thing, I am so sad I will never get to meet Christopher Reeve. Like I always wanted to meet him, and like I guess I'll meet him in the spirit world. So that's right. Thanks. Yeah, just to talk about Superman and how he is important to that graphic novel. But yeah, it's. The last thing I'll say is I really hate that the only criticism I get about it now is like, it's too short. I'm like, I know, what do you think I was trying to do?
Candida, I know you've written about refugee comics, it's right there actually, but I'm wondering, I guess being a refugee seems to me to be a fundamentally disempowering experience by definition. You're driven out of your home, you're driven out of your country, in fact. And what is the role of storytelling and graphic comics in terms of taking some of that power back or having refugees exercise some more agency again over their lives?
Yeah, so there's some really direct projects that do that, and quite a few of the UN camps have art therapy tents, and we have books written by activist cartoonists who have been to camps in Iraq, and also like detention centers in Berlin. There's a fantastic book called Drawn to Berlin by Ali Fitzgerald, and she incorporates drawings that her clients did in her classes. So she was showing them and encouraging them to draw kind of for art therapy, but not all of the people in the class wanted to draw their village being destroyed or the boat that they almost died on. Some of them wanted to draw their grandmother's garden, or they wanted to draw a recipe. This is why I'm interested in food comics. There's a lot of recipes that show up in these comics by people who are survivors, because that's a form of cultural resilience. So we see very practical ways that visual storytelling is being used by humanitarian agencies and UN agencies to help people kind of work through their experiences and represent them back to themselves as counter narratives to the very dominant reductive images of refugees. It's always victims and passive and in need of Western rescue. The other thing we talk about in the book is something we call refugee refusal. And there are a few cartoonists, and it might be, actually, can I get the slide that says how are graphic journalists being accountable? Which is not the question you asked, but I want to show you. There's this fantastic book by a German-British artist called Olivier Kugler called Escaping Wars and Waves, and it's about encounters with Syrians. And he was sent by Doctors Without Borders to several camps around the Middle East where Syrians were living in the post-2015 era. And he has, like, that bottom page, it's huge. This is a really big book that was also an art exhibit. Can we go back to stay on that one image? Yeah. And so that's a double page, and it's kind of hard to read, and it's not really comicsy, but it is visual. But this is the story of a man he met who he could only call the Afghan because he was an undocumented man living in so-called jungle camp in Calais, trying to get onto a truck to get over to the UK. But he didn't want to be photographed and he didn't want his voice recorded. And these were the two methods that this cartoonist was using to draw people's stories. So what he does is he draws that refusal. And he draws the man, I had an arrow once on this slide here. This is the man down here. You cannot recognize his face. He is clandestine. He can't be detected. So he manages to tell his story and the framing of why that story cannot be told for the man's own safety. And there are a lot of different ways cartoonists do this kind of refugee refusal. They might leave panels untranslated. In Sarah Glidden's book about visiting Kurdish refugees in Iraq, she has a whole page of a woman in a shelter who is furious with Western journalists. And she leaves all of her speech balloons untranslated in Arabic. And so you can see the woman's rage, but really only Arabic speakers can understand what she's saying. So it decenters the English speaker and it makes us realize we are outsider to her experience. And just the other image I have, graphic journalists often, same slide, where I've just done highlighted, that's the cartoonists drawing themselves in the story. So Joe Sacco very famously draws himself as a kind of, innocent who has no idea what's going on, and then he gets caught up in things. Another cartoonist I love who works online is Matt Nguyen, who's Vietnamese Australian. And he's done a whole bunch of online interactive comics about his neighborhood growing up, a neighborhood called Cabramatta, a suburb of Sydney where waves of refugees have been housed. Became Australia's heroin capital in the 1980s, and Vietnamese gangs were blamed for it. Those gangs were often young people who had arrived in Australia as the kind of 1.5 generation. They weren't first generation or second generation, they became kind of a lost generation. Anyway, he puts himself in as a little boy, and you have to have read the comic carefully to see that, but he is a kind of insider storyteller here. It's his community, but he was a child, and his parents protected him from what was going on. So there's lots of different visual things, is what I'm saying, that you can draw a story without exposing the individual. And refugees are, the other question about agency, are of course telling their own stories, and often not always focusing on the trauma, which I think goes back to what Sonya was saying. But saying, 2 generations ago, my family had a nursery in Damascus and we grew famous orange trees. But without nostalgia either, just like this is who we were and this is who we are now.
Can I jump in and answer, because I think it might, but your question about how graphic journalists are being accountable, can I, from a journalist perspective, I had an opportunity to work with a comics journalist, Dan Archer, on a piece that I was doing for CBC about a residential school survivor. And I watched him work in what he called slow journalism. And because the art takes longer than video or taking a picture, it just, sitting there, I've watched people like Joe and Dan and our artist on our book, Mongije Paulostekli. I mean, it is a slow process. And doing it with real subjects who are saying real things in real time, what I've observed is that they often share their images with their story subjects and say, am I getting it right? Did you hold the hockey stick with your left hand or your right hand? What do you think? And that process of slow journalism is something that is sorely lacking in journalism today. We need to slow down. We need to be more, slowness helps with accuracy. The process of working with a subject, and I hate to call Mike a subject. I mean, Mike's not a subject. Mike is a co-creator in this book that we have made. We've had many conversations and disagreements about the content of the book. And that's all part of building a relationship with the people that you're telling a story with. And relationships are hard. As we all know, with romantic relationships, they're not always easy. It isn't always a honeymoon. And likewise, when you're working as a journalist in graphic novels, you have to build a relationship with your subjects. The reason that Joe Sacco is so renowned is because he transformed and talk to us about the process of journalism in a way that journalists don't typically do. We don't typically show the warts and all of how we go about trying to find the stories that we end up sharing with the world. And that's what I think is really special about graphics, graphic novels, and the opportunity to illustrate things that are not easy to get video and photos of.
So, I mean, in a way, we're talking about relationships here, and there are different relationships to in terms of collaborating on the novels themselves that I've seen. I mean, Sonya, you're writing, or Sonya, sorry, not Sonya, but you're writing about yourself, which is an interesting dynamic. Duncan, you're writing about George, and you're writing about Mike to some extent. Mike, you're collaborating, or you're contributing to the writing about yourself also, and about your father. But maybe I'll start with you, Mike. But just thinking about how has that kind of changed the way that you understand your father? I mean, I know that's a personal question, but I'm curious how working in this process has actually changed your relationship with your dad and how you understood things.
Yeah, I think the where I'll start with this question there, and I thought about it, and thanks for preparing those and sending them over, giving us an idea of what we're going to talk about. And
Don't give away my secret.
No one's ever done that. And shout out to the glorious sun shower that was. I'm so sorry. Everyone's looking this way. That was very beautiful. Duncan was great with my dad. And I knew my dad would love Duncan. I just did. I mean, there was a journalist in Sioux Lookout, and they used to call him Dunky. So he became Ottawa Dunky. Awesome name. And he loved this guy, and I knew he would. And that's just good people and attract good people, something like that. And then I remember the one time, and Duncan wouldn't push my dad too hard because his health was very bad, and he and my stepmom hadn't figured out how to do his insulin in his stomach. The one day he was lying there, I came because we were doing interviews, and I was stepping up a bit on the home care tip. I had to call my friend who's a nurse. He's like, yeah, he's sweating, his lips are white with salt. She's like, how do I jab him? He goes, flick the thing, get the morning. And I jabbed him at 7:45 in the morning, and he just sprung up, and do what you got to do, right? And you become closer when those moments come, and it's your parents, right? Everybody know that sometimes. And anyways, so Duncan was interviewing my dad, and he says, Mike was an abandoned child. He could have gone to at least the American Hockey League and do. And I'm just like, okay, I get it. And then we were wrapping up for the day, and we were heading over to the hotel nearby by the marina where they lived. And Duncan goes, are you all right? That was pretty heavy. Dad talking about abandoning you when, you were a little child. I says, yeah, I wasn't the part that bothered me. It was the part that said I could have been in the A or I could have been in the N. And it's like, didn't I do good, Dad? But our parents sometimes aren't very good communicators, and sometimes when we become better communicators, that helps us in our relationships and everything, then our parents become better communicators because we pick up those tools that they didn't develop for reasons we come to understand. Residential school trauma, mom fleeing Soviet-occupied Estonia. So it's all very beautiful, and I don't know. I mean, there was times I didn't understand my dad. I was just like, oh, it's like he was, I don't know, but we came together through hockey, we came together through movies, and he couldn't come to Toronto because he had some very tricky traumas from the schools that made it so he couldn't fly. So I'd come to Sioux Lookout in Thunder Bay every chance I could, and I don't know, the process brought us closer together, though. And I think it was really cathartic for him to reflect on his hockey playing days in the schools. And I just really appreciate how Duncan went about that and really kept our wellness and as opposed to like the project's agenda as a priority. And that was baked into the ethics. That was really impressive. Yeah.
Sonya, maybe I'll follow up on that because I'm curious this thing of writing about yourself, and I don't know if it's a deliberate strategy, but you made yourself into a character as well, and I'm wondering if it's your true self or if it's some sort of idealized self that's a bit separate.
It wasn't idealized at all, because if I had my way, I would have had my hair the way it was now. And like my hair is like I was very clear with Riel, who did the art, that I wanted to make sure that everything was as realistic as possible to like how people looked and how people acted back then, or if they didn't have access to certain characters, like there's a racist character called Pennywise in there, I would give her an idea of how I wanted it to look. But it was also very difficult now to read it because, as Duncan said, these take a long time. And in the process of creating that book, I became estranged from the all of my family. And it wasn't easy. I did take out a lot of references to siblings in my book just because I wanted to honor them, but I did keep the references to my parents. And I'm really glad that I ended up writing that story the way I did, because if I did it now, my parents would probably be Magneto, like they'd be villainous in the story. In the story, I wrote them the way I saw them when I was a child. Like I saw them, like even though my parents did have a lot of like really bad things, as a child you don't know any better. So of course, like I thought my dad was brilliant. I thought my mother was beautiful if scary. And I remember she saw the picture of herself as, I remember she was like, I don't know why you thought I'd be so upset about seeing me as this elf queen. Like I'm an elf queen. Why would I be mad about that? And I'm like, you didn't read Lord of the Rings though. And so but I really am glad I was able to honor at least that part of my story, because I'm like, in all honesty, little girl me, I wrote this from the perspective of her and what she knew and what she was aware of. And plus I also just wanted to say, like, what would it be like to write my stories if I were a superhero? Because I always felt that way. As a little girl, that's all I wanted to do was like, okay, if I am Superman, I better act that way. And so I would act in a way that would make Superman proud of me. It was such a weird little thing to do as a little kid, but now that I found out I have autism as an adult, I'm like, okay, I don't know why I pretended to be Superman. But it was also very difficult to write about your own life, because I remember the first time my grandma died when I was 17, and she's in the book. And I was worried everyone was going to see her as the villain, because she's kind of villainous in the story. Nobody got seen her that way. But I remember when Riel sent me the first picture of what she was going to look like in the book, and I burst into tears because it was real. Like it was like, oh, my grandma's visiting again. Or getting to see my grandfather, who unfortunately lost his legs and went blind from diabetes for most of my life, to see him as I remember him walking, and like, it was just such a great thing. And I'm really glad that the projects I do end up healing me in some way, if they are also healing other people. Like, because a lot of the projects I do end up being about me. So it's always like that Euphoria meme where it's like, wait, is this play about us? So it's, yeah, even if it's not about me, there are elements that are usually a little bit from my own experience, especially with being a second generation residential school survivor. Because when I was young, I did not know my parents went to residential school. I was like, oh yeah, luckily, like my family skipped that all, like yay! And then I found out, no, they went to day school. And my mother had medical treatments done on her. And like, I remember the saddest story she told me was like, I asked her when I was doing her process for the residential school funding, she said, when I was a little girl, I wanted to be a teacher. And I went to that school, and after that, I didn't want to be a teacher anymore. And I was like, that's something I'm always going to remember. So yeah. Just like, it's hard to write about yourself, but it's also hard to write about yourself as the big dork you actually were as a kid. Because like, I was so honest in that book, and I'm so glad people from back home haven't figured out who the boys I had a crush on were yet. Yeah, I changed the names to protect the embarrassed.
So maybe I'll throw out a question to the whole group, and maybe Candida, you could start if you want to. But a lot of the stuff we're talking about is also violence or trauma. You could frame it in different ways. But I'm wondering, what are some of the challenges and considerations in representing violence in a way that's ethical, that conveys it as it actually is, but is respectful to those involved?
Yeah, I think that is one of the big problems with it representing any kind of violence, because you don't want to re-traumatize readers, or when you're working in collaboration, you don't want to re-traumatize the people whose stories you're telling. So in terms of comics, I spend a lot of time being like a comic studies nerd and looking at the visual techniques. And comics are similar to film. So just as the film can not show the act of violence, but maybe focus on the face of someone watching so that you see how it's affecting them, comics can do things like that visually so that the reader fills in the gaps of what is not being represented. And often we will fill it in possibly in a more catastrophic way than if we had seen it drawn. So, in comic studies, we talk a lot about the gutter, which is the gap between the two comics, and the conventional theory that people are debating now, because we love to debate things, is that the reader fills in the gap between panel 1 and panel 2. So you might see a child who's happy in panel 1, and then you see the parent walking away out of the room and the child is crying, and the reader has to infer what happened. So comics can use that gap, and that increases reader engagement as well. And one thing I think you're talking about is empathy, Sonya, so that, when you're talking about having empathy for yourself, but also empathy for others, we also think a lot with comics that tell difficult stories about how they can engender empathy because they're so interactive. Because we immerse ourselves into the panels and into the gaps between them. We're completing the story. So there are lots of techniques. Some artists will do blank panels or blacked out panels. Joe Sacco does that when he's telling a story of a man who was tortured in prison. And we get black panels, which again, is even more affecting because you're imagining what happened. So there's a way in which not representing is a way to represent as well. And then there's all the comics things. So Art Spiegelman's Mouse is the sort of landmark serious comic about genocide and the Holocaust, and he does that through animals. So the Jews wear mouse heads, and the Germans, I won't go into it all because that's also controversial. The Poles are pigs, and a lot of Polish people complained at the time. So anytime you choose a trope, it can be controversial. But because comics have this element of the surreal or the fantastical or the super, you can play with that as well, but still tell a realistic story.
Duncan, do you have any thoughts on this?
Coming from the news business, I am very aware of how sensationalized stories of trauma or sadness or pain can become in a headline news format, in a format that has bumpers at the beginning of the show with dramatic music, tonight, all of those things they've evolved because we're well aware, dear reader, what people read. We know that there are lovely stories about the firemen who saved the cat out of the tree that people say they want to hear good news, but we know what stories you spend time reading, and it is the stories of bad things that happen because they're unusual. Those are and so those end up being emphasized in our headlines, our front pages, but it leads to sensationalism. It leads to what in its worst practice is trauma porn. And so I think in this project, we're very aware of wanting to be survivor-centered and to share the stories in ways that the survivors feel comfortable, to empower people who have had their stories taken away from them too often in the past. And so I know when it came to George and Mike's story, perhaps the thing in our initial conversation, one of the very first things that we talked about was that George has been very open about being abused at residential school, and he wanted to know what my thoughts were on how that was going to be visually portrayed. And we spent a long time trying to think that through, talk that through, I spent a long time talking with Mongijik, Paula Steckley, about how we were going to do that, and we wrestled with different ways. I took some inspiration from Kate Beaton, Ducks, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It became such a huge story. There are multiple scenes in which she's abused in a tar sands camp up in northern Alberta. But the one very moving scene, which I was struck by, she goes into a room with a man in a trailer, and then there are, I think, like a dozen panels of just the door on the outside, and stuff happens behind the door, which she chose not to show, but just showed the empty door, and then she walks out. And I thought that was I think the most important thing is making sure that again, the survivors have a voice and a role in trying to come up with how those bad things are going to be visually portrayed.
When Duncan once more took extreme care in broaching the subject of abuse, which my father was very badly affected by, and my dad was really courageous in sharing and knowing how far he was gonna like express to us the things he went through, fully knowing that I was there and I never like had heard this before, but that speaks to like just how amazing my dad was, because he was so considerate of like us in retelling things, the worst things that were happening to him at that time, and it's just like, and that's as far as I'm gonna go with that and whatever. And then it's like, is there anything else, George? Like as we sort of wrap up, we're gonna head back to Toronto and Ottawa, the next day. And he's like, I just want to be helpful, if this can make other people feel like, they weren't alone and everything, and it's super selfless, which I'm really proud of my dad for that. And then we have to consider and never forget that, whatever, people got settlements and stuff, it doesn't like settlements or whatever, but like, and my stepmom would always tell me, she's like, these fellows in suits just sat there and he got a big settlement. Like, do we know what that means? Yeah, right? He got a big settlement. They'll leave it there. And then you relive it, and there's nothing on the other side to like, like what we learned at the Human Rights Museum today. Like we went to the garden, and it was heavy all day, but not overwhelming. And yeah, it's super heavy and stuff, but he's just amazing daddy.
Sonya, do you want to add something?
Yes.
Listening to everybody.
Well, it's just like love listening to everybody. Yeah, like I don't know if you're into Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but do you have like it's like listening to Leonardo talk. You're so wise. He's like, you should have like the swords and everything. I'm like, man, let's go beat up the foot after this or something. You even have the blue, yeah. So.
Does that make me Splinter?
But I think one of the things I wanted to do with this story was like, it was the way I survived my childhood, was imagining I was important, because like creator knows, like I had a lot of people telling me I wasn't. And like, I always felt like I had a destiny, mostly because I loved the book, The Hobbit. And I was like, I want to read a book about a hobbit. Like, and I got in trouble at school because I said that, I said a book was wrong because it portrayed Bilbo as a white guy, and I was like, Miss, the book is wrong. Bilbo is Cree. And then she's like, what? And he's like, yeah, like he's Cree. Look at how much he eats and how much he loves to stay at home. And like when his family thinks he died, they all try to take his stuff. Like that happens here. But I knew with the stuff I showed, I did show a lot of stuff. Like there is a scene where I tell the story about why I stopped riding the bus, and it was because boys pulled my shirt over my head. that was when I started wearing a bra. There was also another scene where I was at a Christmas party and these three boys and I were playing Truth or Dare. And I wasn't actually playing, but they were trying to harass me. And then they said I either had to do one terrible thing, I think it was kiss their feet or something, or give them all oral sex. And I was like, I'm gonna go tell my dad. And then I ran and I remember they grabbed me and I portrayed that scene. But I remember how hard that one was to write, even if it wasn't inherently violent. I still remember that as one of the scariest moments of a very scary childhood, because I'm like, you guys are kids. We're the same age. Where did you learn this? And so some things I would keep in, I could have easily put in a lot of the expected violence of adults against children in that book, and I didn't want to, just because I'm you expect that, but you do not expect bullying, and you do not expect what it's like to deal with racism from another child, that sort of thing. And so I think the only part I was embarrassed by in that story, and it's not even that traumatic, is where I talk about specifically how much I loved U2, the band, and how they got me into activism and how I became a punk. But I also started dressing exactly the same way as a punk boy I liked in the book. And I put that in the book where I'm yeah, but I was also a dumb kid who wanted to like a boy. But I think I don't have too much trouble about portraying my own trauma. But as a documentary filmmaker, I will often tell people, if you say something and even if it's an hour later, you want to change it, I'll take it out immediately, even if it's essential to the narrative. And that's the same thing I do with my own stories, is am I comfortable with everybody knowing this in 20 years? Am I comfortable with the people who are portrayed in this story, even if they're under pseudonyms? Am I okay with them going is this about me? And not that I did approach the people who are named in the story. My parents knew I was writing it. A sibling who was mentioned knew. But I was it's going to be a little bit weird. So if you want to read it, yeah. But I'm hoping, I just like writing in terms of, if a child could experience this, then I think a child should know about it. And that's something I do in regards to residential school. I won't get gory about it, but I did write a children's episode about residential school. It's called Orange Shirt Day for Builder Brothers. And I remember the producers being how are you going to tell a story about residential school without scaring children? And I just focused on the idea of kids being taken away from their parents and losing their access to cultural activities. And the kids were immediately what? That's evil. And so you don't have to go dark to really scare people sometimes. Or traumatize them too.
It came up in the graphic novel that I've been working on with Leila, who's sitting over there, as well as it's the artist Birgit Way and Jilan, the survivor, that we're writing about. Because at one point, Birgit, the artist, came to us and said, there are so many gaps in Jilan's story. There are so many things I don't know. Jilan was quite young at the time. She was 14 years old at the time the events happened, when she was abducted by the Islamic State. And she was frustrated with this as a storyteller, I suppose, because she wanted to tell a story that made sense. And in the end, her solution, I think, was kind of two things. And one was that just kind of became part of the story, because it is part of the story, of course, for a survivor. It is, those gaps are part of the way that they're reckoning with what they experience, reckoning with the past. And visually, she also used leaves and foliage, because trees are very significant in Yazidi culture. So she literally kind of filled the empty spaces and the voids with foliage and with leaves, which was also quite symbolic, and to a lesser extent with some other Yazidi symbolism, like peacocks and peacock feathers, and which I thought was quite an elegant solution. So I want to make sure we get to audience questions. I think I'll just ask one more question for the panel, and then we'll have a short break, and then we'll have questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, think of them, remember them while you're eating cinnamon buns, if you choose to eat cinnamon buns. So I'm also wondering about this, maybe an issue of representation, which is different for different people on this panel, obviously. But if, as you're telling one person's story, there's an obligation to tell a story about the broader community. And sometimes we're kind of purporting to do that. We're telling a story about this woman, Jilan, and that's also a story of the Yazidi genocide. But what are the kind of challenges involved in that? And do you think that's even a thing, that by telling one person's story, you're also telling a bigger story, a community story?
I'll answer. I remember one of my goals in life is to write an Angela's Ashes type memoir, because I remember reading that when I was a kid. I was obsessed with the movie Mommy Dearest and the book as well. And I remember a teacher let me borrow Angela's Ashes. I had to read it to graduate, and I was reading it, and I was like, wait. I looked up Frank McCourt, and I'm like, wait, he wrote this while his mother was still alive? You could do that? So, like, it was something I knew I wanted to do as an older person. I used to quote that to my mother all the time whenever she would upset me. I'd be like, Mom, I'm gonna write a book when I grow up. And so, like, it was something I really wanted to do and such, but, like, it was so silly to do that in a graphic novel and stuff, like, because I wanted to portray people in a, like, not in a positive way, but, like, I wanted to be realistic to the tropes of a superhero comic. And sorry, my brain just ran away. Like, you were, what was the question again? Sorry. Representing yourself. Okay, yeah, I knew as a documentary filmmaker, one of my biggest things was realizing that there's always going to be someone at the Q&A going, why didn't you tell it the way I would have done it? And that was something I faced with this graphic novel as well, because I'm like, okay, the only person I think who could get mad about it would be my parents, but then even then they're portrayed pretty nicely. But like it was, sorry, my boyfriend's just calling, I'm letting him in downstairs, but my building. But sorry, that's why I was checking my phone, I'm not trying to be rude. But like representation was important to me because I never saw Native people in things that I wanted. As Duncan said, like the only time my community was ever mentioned in the news was when something bad happened. And so I wanted to portray a sometimes troubled, a sometimes nerdy, a sometimes very angry Native girl because I'd never seen that before. And anger is often demonized in Native people. So I was like, what was the story I wanted to see when I was 14 or 13? And that was like, even though I knew I was gonna get a lot of like, I didn't get any near the flack I thought I was gonna do for telling that story, because I thought I thought people were gonna get so mad, but no one got mad, everybody loved it, and I was like, okay, good, woo. Like, sometimes when you worry too much about how people are gonna take it, people take it way better than you think they will.
Can I have this slide that says Layla Abdelrazak? I just want to use that as an example, but what I do want to say is in refugee comics, I think there's a strong resistance to feeling the burden of telling the story of a whole community, because the reduction of thousands of people's, millions of people's experiences to one narrative is part of the problem. So a lot of the refugee stories that I work on are very specific, very local. We might want to extrapolate from them, but they're actually resisting that idea that sociologists call them massification, turning a community into a mass, an undifferentiated mass. But in terms of individual and community, I really love this artist, Layla Abdelrazak, who's Palestinian-American. Her book, Badawi, is her father's story of growing up in the Badawi refugee camp, a Palestinian refugee camp in Jordan, I believe, and it's a city now. But she uses Tetris embroidery patterns. So Tetris is a culturally significant embroidery practice. It's also very political because in refugee camps and elsewhere, Palestinian women embroider political messages and slogans. But she uses it to frame her panels. And she also even uses it for her panel layouts, which have this odd kind of slanting geometric structure to them. So this is a cultural element of her community. She's telling one person's story, her dad's and her grandmother's, but she is folding the entire community and the experience of the Nakba and expulsion from Palestine into this highly symbolic border pattern. The ornamentation of the panels is culturally significant. And many people probably know Persepolis by the recently passed Marjane Satrapi. She uses tulips in some of her borders because tulips are of significance to her Persian community. So there are non-narrative elements, things that don't actually tell the story, but also do tell the story visually and fold in a larger community.
Mike or Duncan, or both of you?
So, I, like Sonya, I've just been so inundated throughout much of my life with pan-Indianism and the popular imagery of Indians. And it is what I got into journalism to try to change, to bring our voices. And so when presented with this opportunity to tell George and Mike's story, these two very proud Anishinaabe Ninook Anishinaabe men, what I felt was wanting a high degree of specificity. You talk about responsibility to community. I have this kind of philosophy now as I'm getting older in my life. MAGA, make Anishinaabe great again. Because we are a great people. Mino Bamatsuan, the seven grandfather teachings, Jimon, Weekwas Jimon, birch bark canoes. Like we are a people that have incredible things to share with the world. And those stories need to rise to the top again. And so to work with an Anishinaabe artist, Mangijik Pa Steckley, we do have a couple of rough drafts of some of Mangijik's work. I wish I could show you some of the beautiful panels that he's working on right now about when George is growing up in Lac Seul and learning to hunt with his father, being out on the water. I just think that the specificity of working with an Anishinaabe artist who is well-schooled in the Woodland School of Art has been really important to making sure that we share George and Mike's story in a very specific way so that people know who our people are in ways that our stories deserve to be told and amplified.
It came up in earlier sessions today. I brought it up, but like the thing of these stories are powerful and moving, and if like you don't feel like that, then I'm gonna keep hammering you with them because of whatever. They're human stories, but they're not, and they are generalizable. But I appreciate that like we're not trying to make them generalizable. It's like whatever. I grew up in the annex, like with my Estonian mom, and that afforded me privileges that helped me in sport. And I didn't grow up knowing things I had to know, like from my dad about like drugs and sex and like a great many things. But he was also very angry from the pain and the trauma, and I was protected from that. Did he move up north to like spare me from that, right? Or was he scared he'd come up short as a father? It's like the deepest thing like I've ever said, like personally. And everything worked out, it did. And he hung long enough, he hung on to see me get a damn good job and then to fall in love with someone I love very much. And that's just fantastic. And we made it there just before we lost him. And he wasn't conscious by that point, but he leaned into my hand when I talked to him a couple hours before he made that journey. And the thing I was gonna say too was, when I ceased to be a hockey player, it was like, we had talked about walking away from sport on our terms, Anna Maria and I earlier briefly, and that's just a beautiful thing because like, it says that we're, we know who we are and we're gonna step away on our terms and everything. And then when I was asked to come back to play in Northern Bands hockey in the Northern Bands hockey tournament, 40 teams, Dryden, Ontario, it used to be in Sioux Lookout. I only went back to do interviews for my doctorate on Lac Seul hockey and the ironic origin story where sport was a vehicle for civilizing and assimilating, but we've made it our own since. Great. And we lost in the finals to a bunch of guys who are jerks but are our buddies. We're just a bit better sports, and we're like, we won the most championships, whatever. I'm gonna come back next March break, so that's March break 2023, lose in the finals. Come back March 2024, lose to the same bunch of jerks that are our buddies in the quarterfinals. come back one more time, do some more interviews, win the thing. Now, I don't know if I would have come back if we hadn't won, but I couldn't come back because I got a full-time job now. So the decision was made for me. But the only reason I went into all of this was people come into their indigeneity in time. It takes time, it takes decades. Well, it works in progress. When I was walking to the train station in March of 24, we had Lost in the Quarters. I was watching movies with Auntie M. And I'm like, I'm at peace with hockey. We lost. I love my aunt and whatever. And I'm walking to the train station in Sioux Lookout, and then all I hear is honk. Teammate Isaiah Lawson just gives me a wave in his truck. I wave back at him. He turns. I jump on the train. And it was actually the first time I felt at home in Northern Ontario. I didn't feel that internalized outsiderness. That's how long it takes, and I was like 42. So that's it. It takes time. And this project's a part of like my health, wellness, and healing. That's it, and I'm just grateful.
Thank you. So I think we'll take a short break, just like about a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back with some questions for the audience. We should have time for a few questions, and there are drinks and some pastries in the back. If anybody has any questions, please jump in. If you have questions for each other, I always have
I do have a question, generally. I didn't steal the mic for that reason. I am curious. I don't have, I guess, a very well-worded or specific question. I was trying to think about it. But I've been thinking a lot about food and the impact of that culturally. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about like what you've heard and your perspective around that and what you're exploring at this point.
Do not get me started. So yeah, this is a project that I'm actually going to spend the next few months of the summer as good professors get summers. We have to work all the time. But so it started with some of these refugee comics because the one that I showed you with the Tetris borders has recipes in it. And there are other artists, particularly I've been reading a lot of Middle Eastern female cartoonists who often include recipes or scenes of eating or scenes of sharing food or scenes of gathering food, which can be very political in territories where certain populations are not allowed to go into certain places. So I'm interested in, food ways is the kind of academic term. There's also some really, not less serious, but lovely, charming representations of diasporic communities enjoying food. There's one called Family Style, a graphic novel for young readers by Tien Pham, Pham. And it's about like eating noodles and learning how to eat noodles in the Vietnamese way, even though he's growing up in the US. So there's a whole spectrum of ways that food matters. Also hunger and scarcity, is really important. And I just finished reading actually a comic about an Australian detention centre that I didn't know about when I was reading this book. It's called, it's by Safdar Ahmed, and I will find the name. But it's about a detention centre in Australia called Villawood. And at one point, he's working with Iranian detainees, and he gets Iranian people in the community to make tons and tons of food. And he brings in with the other volunteers, because he's teaching art in the detention center, they bring in these trays and trays of delicious Persian food. And he thought they would have a lovely communal feast and everyone would celebrate the culture. But he said he draws it as people resorting to being like greedy animals, that they're so hungry for the taste of their culture and have been fed terrible food by a multinational called Serco that runs prisons all over the world, that they just push each other aside. And it's not about sharing and community and eating rice together. It's about resorting to survival. And so it's an interesting representation of how we might have sentimental ideas about what food does for us as a community, but for people who have always been hungry or been hungry for a long time, it means something very different. And then the other thing I'll say is there's lots of representations of people living in poverty or in, say, UN camps or in prisons in comics, not getting sufficient food, who nevertheless refuse the shitty food that they're getting. And that's an example of refugee agency. So Don Brown has a comic called The Unwanted. He's a comics journalist. And he shows women speaking fourth wall, breaking the fourth wall to the cartoonist saying, I never asked to be a refugee, and I'm not going to eat this terrible food. I deserve more. And so they don't eat at all. So, there are moments where food is so fundamental to our survival and culture, and it's also very political. So I'm trying to figure out ways to do that. And also quite a few cartoonists also illustrate cookbooks. So there's something interesting there about instructional comics and using comics to teach people how to make things if their grandparents are not around to teach them or their grandparents never learned. So there's all kinds of interesting things around food and culture and comics. And if you want to be my RA and I ever get the grant, let me know.
Thank you. Hi, good evening. My name is Marie-Chantal. I'm a research assistant in the project of Survivor-Centered Visual Narratives. I'm also a graduate student at the University of Manitoba. It was really nice to hear everything you had to share about your experiences doing those graphic novels. I guess my question comes from the perspective of how I've been observing that the youngest generations don't have the type of childhood that I think most of us could say that we've had. So just like you guys, I grew up with graphic novels. I grew up watching a lot of television shows before it became Netflix, and then you could skip simply or not have any commercials. I'm just wondering about the way you want to market and promote the graphic novel so that it reaches the most people to have the impact that you desire to have. Because nowadays, especially with youth, there's more and more young people who now view, for instance, content creation as like a full-time job. And that says a lot about the loss of creative avenues that we used to have and that prioritize play into our growing and development. So I'm just very curious to hear about your views or vision on how to promote the graphic novels you have written and hopefully the impact it's going to have on reestablishing that sense of play, that sense of imagination and creation that is disappearing with social media taking over and TikTok, discussions around AI and so on, new emerging technologies that are quite present now. Thank you.
So one of the discussions that we had, because of course the graphic novel form is something that is very adult as well. I mean, there are very adult themes, and we talked about the violence and some of the language that ends up in graphic novels. And so we have had discussions about who our audience is. Who do we want to reach with our book? And George and Mike, Mongeej again, myself, all agreed that we wanted young people to hear the story, to read the story. I mean, one of the things that I'm very pleased working with Swiftwater is that they also have agreed that the YA audience is something, and so they bring their publisher's expertise. But there's a slide in our deck. We're working with, partnering with Emily Carr College of University of Art and Design to design some extra components of the book. And what the students at Emily Carr proposed was creating an interactive website that would allow young readers of the book to explore aspects of the book through different means. And so it's a deck of hockey cards, which they'll be able to click on and go through the book in a different way and explore multimedia aspects. I was like, when the university students at Emily Carr came to us with this idea, I was like, do kids still play hockey cards? Wow, great, cool. I was very happy about that. But that's an aspect of trying to imagine youth where they are today. I mean, I've also understand, having worked in the TV business for a really long time, trying to imagine what kids are going to like that's a mug's game. Like you really, and if you think you've figured it out, forget it. Then it's not going to be cool. Like I mean, kids are challenging to try to figure out, to say the least. But hopefully it's working in different ways to try to attract them through different mediums, not just a book might be one answer.
I mean, in the modern world, like people sometimes have a hard time watching a show without pulling their phone out. And a lot of shows, if you don't pay full attention, you don't get it. But do graphic novels represent that like pushback, like a step towards digital minimalism and taking it easy on the stupid things? And back to like reading books, and young people are struggling with that because they were born into it. But everything that I've read and I've learned about digital minimalism, and this is just for myself, is that when we do use it more intentionally and take it easy and go outside and read books and even just sit and watch movies without phone, that's even like a really good thing. I think the benefits of what happens come back really, really quickly. And there's not a lot of things in this world that I feel do. And I could do that for the rest of my life and, get a little remuneration and be happy. So not today, but that's it. And comic books could be that road back to like reading books. I feel that because it's so disarming. You can sit there, fall asleep to it, read a few pages, pick it up, put it down.
Well, it's funny that the moderator was mentioning about Bangladesh because before I went to Bangladesh, this is way like about almost 15 years ago, I thought everybody had the same access to technology, to the internet, blah, blah, blah. And this was way before like phones were as commonplace as they are. But I realized that as long as there's places where you can't get reliable internet, where this basically becomes a brick, there's always going to be books. And I mean that specifically for the schools in the north that I visited where internet is very unreliable. You have to rely on Musk's space link or whatever it's called, like the evil like James Bond-ish satellite dish. But like as long as there's going to be access to things that can break, I think books will always be available. Just because like they don't break, you can take them anywhere and stuff. But also I believe like if you make content creation as boring as it actually is to make, kids won't want to do it because it is boring. Like my beloved little nephew, who I call Pork Chop, wanted to be a YouTuber because he was like, I just play games and talk and it'll be fun. And his dad is a filmmaker, so he showed him what it actually involves and took him through the editing and stuff. And it was like, I love bursting the bubbles of kids I talk to because I'm like, it's really boring. It's like, imagine having to watch yourself for 8 hours. And they're like, oh, I have to do that? And I'm like, at first, yes. And so, yeah, I think sometimes I believe like, it's just like what Mike said, like there's benefits for it because people would talk about the same thing in terms of like, oh yeah, people are talking in movies and that's going to lead to the end of the world. Like, oh no, like, and stuff like that. I believe there's always a place for technology. I think the people who are just trying to make it everything, that's where the problem lies. Because I personally don't believe in AI. I should believe it's you, but like I don't really want to use it just because I feel like it's kind of letting you be lazier, which I don't really like. Plus, it's like I love writing, so of course I'm going to come up with my own lists or my own map through the museum. Like, get away from me, computer. But like, I think as long as little kids love buying bookmarks and stickers and those posters of like, Ferraris and stuff at book fairs. Like, I think there's always going to be a place for books, even if technology keeps marching on. Because like, books are cool. Like, kids like the tactileness of it. And and it was always my dream to write a book. And to go into a library in northern Manitoba now and see mine is just super cool. So it's like, I don't know. I think books are always going to be here forever. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Ege. I'm also, like Mary Chantel, a Masters of Human Rights student, and I'm currently doing a practicum with the Prison Libraries Committee, which is also doing a graphic novel project, and just going through their like drafts, little reading what's happening with them. It's again based on kind of the survivor narratives, and what I've been seeing with those is that there's always a triumph. It's always winning something. Like first, maybe you like in a battle, you first like fall down, but you get up. It's usually what the stories are. Like the stories are kind of going that way. Do you think that's a good way of doing the graphic novels? Do you think like it can then like the graphic novels who are about survivor narratives, who are aiming for some sort of social justice, they should be have good endings, or can they have bad endings? Can they be triumphants in a way? How do you see the ending should be in those books?
Yeah, I'm suddenly thinking about, I don't know if you guys have little kids in your life, but the TV show Bluey, there's a line where they read a story that doesn't really have an ending, and they're like, what kind of ending is that? Like, is it a good ending or a bad ending? Why isn't, and then the teacher tells them, because life has enough bad endings, so it's like sometimes good endings need to be in stories. And so I've always believed that I would rather err on the side of positivity, because that's like the books I loved when I was a kid. I would always look for the bright side in my own story, and that was something I had to do for this graphic novel. And like, I guess it depends on the writer, because somebody like Frank Miller writing my story would be way different than me writing my story. You know what I mean? Like, and I guess it's where you land on the spectrum, because like I could have made a completely dark story with this depending on how I looked at it. But I decided like, no, like, even though like the whole point of the story is, oh yeah, Sonya got to move away from the res and go to U of M, and like, this is what, and she left the res and she's going on to better things. But that's not the true ending of my own life story, right? Because how many well, it sounds terrible, how many happy endings have we had in life? Like, how many good storybook endings have you had in your life? But how many devastating endings have you had in your life? So it's just like, I guess how you want to look at it is like, I could make this story incredibly positive because that's how I want to remember it, or I could do like the dark side just to show people what it actually was like. And I guess that's the story you want to tell, basically. Yeah, like, where do I want this to go? That's usually what you come up with at the start of the story. Like, where do you want it to head? That sort of thing.
This is such an interesting question, because I often feel this kind of conflict, and I ask myself this question as a scholar and as, you know, a sort of expert reader or whatever. I'm not. I often misread things and my students correct me. But I want complicated endings. I want open endings. I want to be left thinking about what happened. And I had a really good lesson. I teach sometimes online courses with students in the north. U of Winnipeg has a program to train older adults to come back, Indigenous adults to come back and train as teachers, mostly to be teachers in their own community. And these are the best students I've ever had, because they have life experience and they watch films and they're interested in everything. And I allowed the final project to be either an academic essay on autobiography and own voice storytelling, or they could do a comic. And all of the comic story arcs that I got, because we had a story arc first, were exactly what you're talking about. So triumph over adversity, difficult circumstances, but everything has worked out well. And I kind of wanted to say, couldn't you make this a little more complicated? This seems a little cliched, but it's their story, right? And that's the story they want to tell, and that's how they want to shape their experience into a story. And whether that's influenced by what they think the story should be, or what their life should be, or it is the truth, that's not for me to say. So I kind of learned a lesson there about, this is the way that these students wanted to tell their story. And I might, as a reader, feel that it's been done before, or it's not complex enough. But that's not really the question or the judgment I should be making, right? I should more be thinking about, what are they saying in the way they're telling this story? What else does it reveal? So yeah, I completely feel your question, and I'm really interested in your work.
It's a great question. But I think there's a reason why the works that you're reading and the students' works, the hero's journey, or the quest is, I mean, it's almost a universal style of telling a story. There have been, there are many different cultures have employed that model of telling a story, and so it's not a surprise that it should show up. But I'm going to make things even thornier. One of the, when you're sitting down and listening to an Anishinaabe elder tell their story, sometimes you're like, did it end? Is it over? Is the story? How did it end? Stories that have a beginning, middle, and an end. Often in traditional Anishinaabe narrative, there is like the endings kind of trail off into you're not sure what the lesson is. There is no pat answer at the end which says this is what you must think, son. That can be a very Western device. This morality tale that says this is what you must think about this story, dear reader. And so that's something it can be a challenge for when you're starting to think about other cultures reading a story. What is it over? What am I supposed to?
That's a really good question. It really had me thinking here, particularly when it's like the book version of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. His love interest passes away, but in the movie, he goes back to reunite and goes back to the future because whatever. And then on social media, presenting our idealized self, for instance, or like airing out our problems, like there's a fine line to it, then bringing it back to the graphic novel, if I may. I think of my dad's life, and he would have told Duncan and I as much and said, like, I was that Indian boy who never had a chance. He was identified as a genius early on. He was writing poetry by his early 30s and had a film screening in Monaco in 78, sometime around when Indians Don't Cry was first published. And he had a date with the Princess of Monaco, and that's the story. But such a good storyteller. And sometimes I'm just like, well, the particular things he went through didn't allow him to, quote, monetize or experience success or maintain full-time jobs, and all the anger and all the trauma and sadness. And then I think about it, and it's like, whoa, all the struggles and the lower income for his whole life, for how brilliant he was, and everything he gave back to the community in terms of like recovering like the flooded graves and digging up arrowheads because he had the gift of finding these artifacts, all so selflessly, really not getting paid much for any of it, didn't want to get paid for any of it until his last like years and months doing work with Alicia Colson in like radical anthropology work, and he just didn't stop, and he just always had awesome ideas, even if he had a hard time following through with them. To me, that's the wonderful legacy of his life, that it wasn't success in the way our Western world measures or celebrates that. So he's just really noble and selfless, and I guess it goes on through me, and that's as much as I wrote in the museum earlier when it asked, where do you go from here in that blanket exhibit? And I said, I'm just going to honor my father's legacy, who's a survivor of the schools, that I should be so lucky to have a job that seeks to incorporate Indigenous curricula to Camp U of T sports camps that I went to when I was a kid. So it's a good question.
So this is the ending of the story. But I wanted to, on behalf of the Survivor Centre Visual Narratives Project, I wanted to thank all of you for coming. And especially I also wanted to thank our 4 panelists. I thought it was a really interesting conversation, so thank you so much. And I will thank Ellie for helping out at the back and in general helping.